All right, so the first thing that we've got effectively two major topics to sort of go through today in the development class. One is to talk about land development and kind of the issues surrounding land development. And then the other is to talk about multifamily residential development. And so in starting with the land development, now, once again, you can approach this, several different ways in terms of how you choose to prepare for class or not prepare, that sort of thing. But there were two chapters effectively that deal with these two topics in your real estate development book on, once again, one on land development and then one on multifamily. Has a lot of the background material. The way that this book is written, and I think I may have mentioned this before, is it is broken into chapters by product type, and much of the material can be repetitive from one chapter to the next, because what it really does is it kind of takes you the whole path down for each individual product type. So there's going to be overlap as you're reading the chapters. Sort of say, well, they talked about, whatever it is, tax increment financing in this chapter, and they talk about it again in another chapter, and so forth, so on, to the extent that it applies for whatever product type that they're actually dealing with. So what we want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about specifically what are maybe some of the unique characteristics associated with each of these types of approaches to development. Now, land development, if you were describing to someone what is land development, I mean, how would you actually describe that? I mean, what kind of development is taking place there? What are you actually doing with land development?
You'd be buying big, fairly large tracts of land and dividing it up. Subdividing, putting in probably some infrastructure.
Exactly, putting in a lot of the infrastructure in terms of the roads, the sewer systems, maybe utility hookups to the street level. So there's going to be a lot of site prep work, okay, for land development. So the whole thing, the traditional sort of approach to land development is, yeah, you're buying these large parcels of land that maybe historically have been used as agricultural land or just simply unimproved land that has maybe sat there for generations without necessarily any improvement. So the idea for most land development projects is that you're effectively taking raw land and converting it into some sort of use. Now, the typical sort of large-scale, land assembly has been predominantly focused on single-family residential and developing large subdivisions of homes. But yet, land development can also be, the situation of where you are acquiring these large parcels, and yeah, you are subdividing it. And what it means by subdividing is you're basically taking this big parcel of land that you have acquired and sort of laying it out. And it could be 100% residential, or you could be carving out pieces of it that might be commercial. Okay? And this is where you probably have the most freedom that you're ever going to have as a real estate developer is with land development, because here is where you can work in tandem with a local government and effectively say, I want to build a city or some component park, okay, depending on what resources you may have available. And so it's the idea that you can kind of go in many cases, as I said, much of this land maybe historically has been agricultural or just simply unused land, that you can go into one of these local governments, in some cases smaller communities that may have this within their purview in terms of extraterritorial jurisdiction, and say, all right, I want to take this 600-acre parcel of land and build so many homes on it. I want to build so many square feet of commercial space. I also want to pop in a couple of schools, couple of government facilities. I want to put in roads. I want to do all of this sort of stuff. And here, as I said, you're going to probably have the most freedom, because to a certain extent, you can work in tandem with the city of actually establishing what the individual land uses are going to be, as well as what, if there's going to be zoning included within this particular development, you can work with them to actually develop what the zoning is going to be, or if there's going to be form-based codes that are going to designate what the properties must look like in terms of architectural characteristics, you know, in terms of overall design and appearance. So in one sense, this is for some developers, this is the most fun, because you really do have probably a lot more opportunity to effectively kind of create things, okay? But, that having been said, does not mean you're not going to meet with resistance from, whatever local government that you may, be working with, because what might be their issues? I mean, for example, you may be in a situation of where that all of this has already been developed, and the surrounding area is the area that you've purchased for your sort of large-scale land assembly to actually develop, once again, a combination of homes, commercial, whatever you want to do. So what are going to be some of the issues that you're going to have, assuming that all of this is within one local government? What are going to be some of the issues that you may face from the folks that already live there and effectively are in control of the regulatory aspects?
You don't want to outdevelop the population?
Or sort of growth controls, okay? The whole thing of these guys effectively saying, we're quite happy with the size of our community and how big it is and the boundaries of our community. We love having all of this as undeveloped land and open space, and for all intents and purposes, we want to keep it that way forever. But yet, you've bought the land with investment-backed expectations of actually being able to do something with it, but yet, these folks potentially are being optioned. Now, why? I mean, you think, hey, this is a great opportunity. I'm going to increase your tax rolls as a developer by developing this land. I'm going to give you more shopping than you currently have, more housing product choices than you currently have had. So why would they even be opposed to something like this?
You're ruining my views.
Okay, you're ruining my views, or where I go jogging, or just the fact of noise or traffic congestion, or all those sorts of things. Those kind of, I don't want any of this stuff. That you've heard that term NIMBY, not in my backyard. And it's that whole thing of folks that are already there don't, in essence, want anyone else new to kind of come into their community because they feel as though they're content with how it has developed. And so you have a lot of communities that have that attitude, okay? But yet, from the developer's point of view, once again, your whole thing is, I'm trying to create jobs, I'm trying to effectively build new homes, new shopping centers, new, to effectively progress, move things forward. It's not that every square inch of land has to be built upon. That's not what you're saying. What you are trying to say is, well, we have a demand for housing, we have a demand for all this stuff, we need to build more of it in order to satiate that demand. So how do you potentially, I guess, deal with stuff like that? I mean, as the developer.
Public outreach.
Yes, absolutely. And that is, I mean, I have sat in plenty of roundtables with developers that talk about their individual strategies of how they approach something like this, and in every single instance, it's get out there, get to know the people within the community, especially your opposition, find out what their key hot button issues are, do your best to try to address those to the extent that you can, and so that you hopefully can kind of sway enough of them to your side to be able to move the project forward. Because it is a political process, without question. And it's not an absolute slam dunk that these folks are going to be inherently in favor of your project. Because, and it's even more so the case here in Florida, and this is not meant to overgeneralize, but it tends to be more the case here in Florida than other parts of the country. You have a very active retiree population here. People who have nothing but time on their hands to effectively oppose any new development that effectively comes to town, because they're thinking in most instances, this is going to increase my property taxes, this is going to increase congestion. I'm happy where I'm at. I don't want anything else to be built, and I want to, you know, continue my life as it is right now for the next 15, 20 years or so. I mean, would you disagree or agree with that, or?
Sounds right. People fear change, and
So I mean, it's. But you know, as I said, it's a question though then of how you can deal with something like that, because you know, in the past, it may have been, you know, one or two kind of knuckleheads that, you know, sort of stand in your way that, you know, would have difficulty getting themselves organized, whereas now, these folks very easily can organize themselves and much, you know, more efficiently than you can possibly imagine, to have their entire neighborhood show up at a hearing to effectively oppose your project. So that, you know, is certainly something that kind of works against you, but at the same time, you, on the other hand, if you can get your list of supporters, can hopefully have an equally, you know, kind of, you know, a good defense to eventually their offense. Yeah.
The strategy we use is we try to hire locals through the entitlement process in every market we go to, just because they tend to know everybody in the community and push it forward.
Without question, that helps. There's no question about it. I mean, but you know, even you know, with the hiring of locals, you know, still doesn't always, you know, deal with all the issues that you know, some of these folks, once again, they're absolutely, you know, stuck in whatever decade they're stuck in with regard to kind of what should take place, right?
One thing that we've had a lot of success, along with the public outreach, is meeting with the decision makers beforehand.
Yes.
Not as a group, not
Yep.
to trigger the quorum, but
Yep.
figure out what their hot button issues are,
Yep.
address their concerns, so when you go to the public hearing.
Yeah, because unfortunately what tends to happen is if you don't do any of that, then it's a bunch of boom, 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 you know, like literally you're being attacked by machine gun fire from all different fronts, and then everybody starts ganging up, you know, on the developer of, oh yeah, I like her issue, I'm gonna, you know, jump on that one as well, you know, I'm gonna jump on his issue, you know, and so forth, so on, and then it becomes this bloodbath that ultimately nothing happens, you know. And I have personally seen some just horrific situations of where, you know, a developer comes in and is literally seconds away from getting the vote necessary to secure their project, only to have it thwarted by one single sentence. I mean, this is the perfect case in point. In Texas, several years ago, I was attending a city council meeting in a town, Murphy, Texas, up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and this city pretty much had two major thoroughfares that went through it, like a lot of cities, and then had a railroad for deliveries and whatever to commercial or industrial sites. And this particular person was wanting to develop basically this site here, and it was going to be an industrial site, and effectively be doing some loading and unloading from the rail lines, you know, each and every day for, you know, 30 minutes at a time or whatever. Anyway, this whole thing, and I'm obviously kind of setting it up so you can figure it out on your own, but this whole thing went through the entire approval process, had these amazing diagrams, had done all their market analysis, you know, all the design issues were, you know, done. I mean, literally was in the final, you know, meeting with the city council, and, you know, there were probably only 20 people, you know, attending the meeting, but this one guy stood up literally seconds before the vote was taken and said, excuse me, but whenever they're loading and unloading, they don't actually have a spur that allows them to effectively back the car up and unload. They're going to pretty much have to unload directly from the track. Isn't that going to block both of our major thoroughfares in the city, and therefore block access for any sort of fire trucks, police vehicles, and that sort of thing to get from one part of the city to the other? No one had thought about that. No one. No one had considered, I mean, it seems like, you know, once again, I oversimplified it, But no one had considered that, and literally it killed it. Done. Now, all that having been said, if it had been built, that would have been a problem. There's no question about it. That would have been a problem. I'm not saying it should have been built. My point is to get that far, that deep into the situation, and then to have something like this just blow up. I mean, so that's what I'm sort of saying, that this is not even an issue of effectively opinion. It's just a fact. Yeah, you're going to cut off major, the access to pretty much the rest of the city because of the way that this rail line happens to run. Okay. So, but
they couldn't adjust to the road.
in this particular, it wasn't a fixable situation. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
So, but getting back to the land development aspect of all of this. So the big picture is, yeah, you're assembling large parcels of land, you're subdividing those parcels, you've got the control to sort of designate the different uses that you want, to effectively set up the architectural standards, the design codes to effectively, like for example, a perfect case in point, something that is probably exceedingly important here up front as a land developer is to put into place what are called deed restrictions. Okay? And deed restrictions effectively allow you as the developer to set very rigid standards, or as rigid as you want them to be, for what takes place within your development. Now, the typical kind of set of deed restrictions, I mean, I don't know, you guys that are involved with residential development, that chances are you're going into a residential development or a subdivision that has already been created by a master developer. They have already established certain design guidelines, certain size guidelines with regard to what kind of homes can be built, what kind of roof they can have, what color schemes they can have, how much landscaping they have to have, all those sorts of things. And have already designated a lot of that up front in terms of the deed restrictions. And then based upon that, they can also control who the developers or who the home builders are that actually come into those developments to actually build. They must meet certain criteria and, once again, certain style guidelines, certain quality, those sorts of things. And so there's a lot of control that the developer can enact that are effectively private sector land development controls. This is totally separate, totally apart from what the public sector is doing. The public sector, is going to come in and potentially, establish their own set of, building codes, their own, zoning codes and setback requirements and that sort of thing. But the developer can effectively create even a more rigid set of standards than the local government does, so that they can control precisely what takes place in terms of the quality and scope and type of development. Yep.
So if you develop a parcel of land, you can actually dictate what type of...
Absolutely.
Really? Okay.
You can dictate almost anything. I mean, now granted, it can be challenged in court,
Right.
but you can dictate almost anything up front as to what that development can ultimately take. And the interesting thing about that is that will run with the land. From a legal perspective, it is something that inherently the future owner is burdened by what restrictions that you have placed on that property. And the whole idea behind it is that because of that level of control that you can exert through these deed restrictions, it effectively is an insurance policy for those folks that locate within this particular area, that the standards are going to be held to a certain level. And also, the other thing to keep in mind is no one is forcing you to move into this area or to develop within this area. These deed restrictions, you have to accept them whenever you purchase the property. In other words, if you're going to purchase the property, you are, by nature of purchasing, accepting those deed restrictions.
That makes it harder to fight in court.
Right. Because you've effectively, even though you may have just kind of like, oh, okay, whatever, you still technically accepted them.
So you can say something like the company buying this piece of land must have at least 35 million in revenue, experience.
You could.
And you can
Yeah, you can also set up, like, for example, and every jurisdiction can pretty much set up their own set of standards, and one that you're kind of referring to potentially is like a conditional use permit sort of an environment whereby you can say, we're not going to effectively mandate specifics on what can locate here, but what we're going to do is reserve the right to effectively say no. That if we don't think that it's an appropriate use or appropriate tenant or appropriate whatever it might be. Does that make sense?
Can't you take a cut of the association, did you?
I'm sorry?
Can't you take a cut?
Yes, absolutely. As the master developer, you can be funded partially through those fees that are generated by the homeowners associations. And effectively that's, part of what helps perpetuate their life.
Yeah.
Is because without those fees, they don't have the, effectively the wherewithal to really engage in the legal action that might be necessary to protect, whatever those standards are. I mean, the kinds of things that are ridiculous, in one sense that you've probably heard about over the years with homeowners associations is, that are set up by the developer that, they can mandate all sorts of things. They can mandate how tall your grass can be. That your grass must be of a certain type, must be within so many inches in height. If it gets above that height, we'll automatically take control and have it mowed and charge you. Can't have any, pink flamingos in your front yard or engine blocks hanging from your trees or cars parked in your yard or, all the colors on the homes must be of a certain, tone, must have a certain type of roof, can't have solar panels on the roof, although that has subsequently been changed where that it was possible for the homeowners associations to say they're unsightly, but now the government has stepped in and effectively said, well, they can no longer do that. So that's one example of kind of where that's been kind of pushed to the side. But the point being is there's a lot of stuff that you can put into place as the developer up front to shape what that community is ultimately going to look like.
After you purchase a property, can you add an additional deed restriction?
Absolutely. I mean, even you as an individual property owner just of a lot, technically you can add a deed restriction on there that would ultimately impact future owners. I mean, like a perfect case in point, there was a property that I wanted to purchase several years ago. It was an old school building, and it was an elementary school, and I wanted to convert it into loft apartments. Each classroom would basically be a different, loft apartment. But one of the deed restrictions that the school district placed was this property cannot be used for another school, which didn't bother me. But it precluded. But part of the reason they did that is they didn't want any like private schools potentially opening up, in terms of competition, that sort of thing. And so, right there, that pretty much eliminated, that whole category of use for that property. But that was one of the deed restrictions that was put into place. So the whole notion of residential use, that was okay. Make sense?
Did you do it?
Didn't do it. Couldn't make it work.
Sounds cool though.
Well, it was cool, and actually, I've seen a project in Atlanta, Georgia. They took an old elementary school and turned it into apartments. That's actually where I got the idea from. And I mean, it was just amazing. If you can imagine, like one of these old, schools built in the early 1900s that they're built rock solid, literally, and the rooms are perfect size for loft apartments. All you got to do is once again put in a little kitchen, little bathroom area, and you're done because they've got obviously windows all across the side. I mean, it's a really cool thing.
I just saw the reverse actually. I seen an old apartment building, kind of small, and they converted it to a preschool.
Yeah.
Like it was pretty cool. And like the little courtyard, that's where the kids play and stuff.
Okay.
It was
Gotcha.
pretty nice.
Okay, so other things related on the land development thing. So infrastructure is going to be a big one here. Who pays for it? That's a big question. Who pays for the infrastructure? And in some cases, it's automatic within a jurisdiction as to who's going to pay for it. that in most instances, it's going to be the developer is going to pay for the roads going through the property, is going to pay for the curbs and the gutters, is going to pay, now the part that begins to be kind of tricky is who's going to pay for the water lines and for the sewer lines. In some cases, the local government will pick up the tab on running those to the actual property, to the lines, property lines for each parcel within the property. In other instances, the developer may be required to do that, okay? And in order to pay for that, a lot of the jurisdictions will charge development impact fees, which effectively all it's really doing is just passing along the cost to the individual homeowners ultimately, but it allows the developer to kind of recoup those costs up front whenever the property is sold. The one thing that you've got to, and this is a very simple sort of concept, and this is not meant to be a liberal or conservative sort of statement, but increased regulation for developers increases costs. But you hope that it also increases quality. Okay, everybody follow what I just said? Increased regulation increases cost and hopefully increases quality. Because there's a lot of regulation that a local government can put into place, while it increases cost, doesn't increase quality. It's just some random piece of legislation that they may, want to enact that just creates hurdles for artificial hurdles for a development to actually meet, knowing that the cost of compliance is too excessive to allow any project to basically be feasible. Does that make sense? And there's a lot of gamesmanship that can go on within that process to make that occur. But whenever, once again, let me kind of go back. Think about, okay, the opposite of that. The opposite of that would be decreased regulation, decreases cost, but probably decreases quality. In other words, it becomes anything can be built here.
That's like driving through a gated community and then going down a random street that doesn't have
any controls whatsoever.
They just do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see the quality difference.
Yeah, and it's huge. And and you would like to think there's a nice happy medium in there somewhere. Because sometimes the gated communities just, once again, just go crazy with, the over-regulation of things to the point of just absurd, and the other end of the extreme is anything goes, and, it's just a horrible, visually disturbing sort of, neighborhood, versus, hopefully something kind of, middle ground. But it's, most developers tend to have the attitude, we want less regulation, if it applies to us. But we want, we want to impose more regulation on everybody else because, once again, they're not going to be as generous or as thoughtful and whatever else as we are, so we've got to make sure they don't screw things up. Does that make sense? Yep.
Can you take a neighborhood and make it a HOA?
Yeah, you can. If you can get basically everybody to
Like, would everybody have to be on board?
pretty much. That's probably going to vary state by state, but my suspicion is that you can, but you would probably have to have virtually 100% buy-in. Because it would be hard, you'd be hard pressed to try to enforce something on someone that's already there and, effectively force them into compliance with whatever it is that you're trying to do or trying to accomplish. At least that would be my expectation. There's probably a way that, once again, now, if that local, however, caveat being, if that local government already has in place a statute or, on their local books that says, for that very purpose, as long as you can get 75% of all adjacent property owners within a specified area to agree upon blah, 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 then, because that's what happens like with historic districts, is there's usually a set standard within the community of saying that if you can get, because not everyone is ever going to, sort of agree to become part of a historic district, but there have been enough precedents there to sort of say, if you can get maybe, once again, 60% or 70%, whatever that threshold is, of the residents to agree to making this conversion, because with a historic district, you have that same kind of thing that sort of comes into play, that now all of a sudden you have all these self-imposed restrictions of people can't just simply repaint their house without getting some level of approval, because now it has to, the color schemes have to be approved by the local Historic Landmark Commission. So, once again, it's self-imposed, but yet, nonetheless, it's still there. Now, this also brings up, kind of another thing, that there are local governments who have chosen themselves to not really get involved in the regulatory process and have allowed the developers to be fully responsible for setting all of the development codes, or a good portion of them, and actually enforcing them. The most famous city in the country to do that is actually in Texas, in Houston. Houston does not have traditional zoning. It actually is set up of a wide variety of districts that have effectively a number of deed restrictions, that the deed restrictions in a lot of cases are actually being enforced by the city. So it's a weird thing, because deed restrictions are a private sector form of land development regulation, but there, in some instances, you have the actual city of Houston doing the enforcement. But it's also part of the reason why in Houston you have some wacky stuff going on in terms of adjacency of uses. That if you drive around Houston, have any of you ever been to Houston? That you've got a situation of where, like within a neighborhood, it is very possible there is no buffer zone between a single-family residential neighborhood and a major shopping center, office building, whatever. So, you literally could be 10, your front door could be 10 feet away from some, major development. And it's weird. And, you don't really, experience it until you're there, and you sort of, well, that's awfully odd to have a single-family residence literally right there, So, but that's the way that they, chose to allow the city to develop, and they've tried many times to enact zoning, and the populace rises up and says, we don't want it. So, interesting. Okay, so what are some of the other things when we're sort of talking about land development, some of the things specifically that, as you were reading through, hopefully a couple of you, kind of reading, I know, Dustin, you said you read through some of the material. I mean, what were some of the other things that sort of brought up here that you want to talk about?
Oh, and that's in the book?
The land development stuff. Because infrastructure was a big one. The whole thing of subdivision, kind of, and kind of the process of going through.
I didn't read the land development part, but okay. On the other ones, it was just kind of like thresholds of for residential versus office, what IRR should be for. Right.
Well, okay. So for this one, part of once again what they spent a lot of the time sort of discussing up front was what it means to subdivide land. What are some of the issues relating to subdividing the land? Who pays for the infrastructure? What sort of negotiations that you may have to engage in with the local community with regard to getting the infrastructure paid for. It also kind of gets into the discussion of, once again, creating effectively more than just single-family residential developments, but also having sort of planned unit developments or mixed-use developments or master planned communities. And there's this whole idea of, once again, you as a developer kind of being able to have a fair amount of control over what actually happens to your parcel. Also, it kind of gets into some of the issues relating to, are you going to be required to do environmental impact statements? Big, massive, huge issue here in Florida, because you have so many wetlands that you've got to protect. We don't have as much of this issue in Texas, but here is a major issue that, before you do any sort of large-scale land development, you've got to go through and perform what is called an environmental impact assessment and impact statement to determine whether or not your development that you're proposing is going to have any sort of a detrimental impact on native wildlife and any sort of grasslands or marshes or whatever it may be. And while I don't know all of the details, and some of those of you that have been here more local, that this became a huge issue, and actually part of the whole reason why we have the National Environmental Protection Agency that was started back in the early 70s was actually because of Florida. Because a lot of the development that took place in the Everglades. And what was happening was effectively, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres of land were basically being sort of taken over for development and effectively eliminating the habitat for, you know, those local, you know, indigenous sort of species. Now, we could argue, is that a big deal or not? You know, once again, you know, we could argue, well, whose habitat are we really taking over? You know, are we taking over, you know, a bunch of alligators? Are we taking over, you know, certain types of birds? Are we taking over habitat for, you know, what is it that, you know, is being potentially destroyed in the name of development? But all of that sort of aside, the big thing to sort of keep in mind is, for the most part, if you're doing any sort of a large-scale land assembly, you're going to have to do an environmental impact statement to ultimately assess what damages that you might potentially be bringing upon the natural environment. With that, you typically have to come up with what is referred to as a mitigation strategy, okay? And that mitigation strategy is the whole thing of where you would say, okay, I am potentially going to have to destroy 5 acres of wetlands, but my mitigation strategy is I am going to offset the 5 acres of wetlands I destroy here by creating 10 acres of new wetlands over here that will hopefully take the place of those wetlands. And the idea behind that is a topic, it's called wetland mitigation banking. And it's an opportunity, it's also another term for those of you who took the law course, you probably were exposed to the term transferable development rights, or TDRs, okay? And that's that same sort of concept of effectively, if we allow you to do it over here, we're going to create this no net loss sort of situation of where hopefully you're creating something a little bit better elsewhere in an area that may not be great for development, but is great for creating basically this alternative to how this land was being used over here. Make sense? Okay.
So when they create these wetlands, do they like take all the species that were here and move them to the?
It's a whole process that begins with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers of making sort of assessments as to what it's going to take and what the action plan is going to be in terms of, you know, and what kind of species you're dealing with. Are you dealing exclusively with migratory birds? Are we dealing with, you know, certain land-based animals that you potentially are going to be relocating? You know, so there's a lot of other, you know, things that get brought into that. It's not just simply we're creating this new piece of land over here. There is a lot of thought given to how you're actually going to make it be a replacement. Okay, all right. So other things that we probably want to talk about here, let's see here, we talked a little bit about the growth control things. Well, actually, let's talk a little bit more about growth control. So this whole idea that a local government can create, in some cases, like a artificial boundary of where development can occur within a certain, like an urban development boundary, or, you know, and in the U.S., probably 2 places that fit this the best are like in Oregon and Seattle, where they have effectively kind of said, even though we've got all this undeveloped land, all of this timberland and everything else, we're going to effectively say you can pretty much only develop within the circle. And everything surrounding that needs to be retained as effectively undeveloped land. And a lot of other places, you know, across the country and across the globe have these same kind of things of urban growth, they call them different things, but urban growth boundaries is one, but, or, you know, restricted development zones or whatever it might be. But the whole idea behind it is that you actually are trying to intensify the amount of development that occurs here and effectively, you know, minimize any sort of development activity outside of that sort of boundary. So what do you think about that? Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? To have those kind of restrictions in place?
It reduces the potential upside of economic benefits.
Okay, how so?
For developing, the area outside the circle has some potential value to be developed and can provide that.
Yeah, so in one sense, it keeps the value of that outlying land down because it has no real economic value because it, at the moment, cannot be developed. Now, all of a sudden, you have a regulatory change that says, now we can develop it, you know, up go the values. And it also has the impact because you have constrained the development here. What it tends to do is to be much more of a case for redevelopment. Basically say that, you know, you have a building that you know is not so great a shape that, well, it's time to redevelop it, as opposed to just go build a brand new one out in an outlying area. And this is yet another perfect case in point about Texas. You know, I love Texas, but one of the biggest problems, no real boundaries. You know, pretty much the whole mantra in Texas, and it's why the development is so much easier there than virtually anywhere else in the country. And also one of the reasons why the economic engine continues to roll so well is because there are very few restrictions, except in very small pockets. And so outside of that, you can pretty much build almost anything anywhere. Well, there's a downside to that too. That what you end up happening is you'll have areas that maybe were developed 20, 30 years ago that are now combat zones because they haven't been maintained because there's no real incentive to basically upkeep. Does that make sense? Whereas whenever you have, you know, a lot of times these sort of growth controls, you've got a much greater incentive to, because the property value doesn't decline to a point of where it's next to nothing.
What was the term you used for this?
Well, this particular part would be urban growth boundaries.
What was it?
Urban growth boundaries. Okay? And so the whole idea, though, is that by having those constraints, those sort of artificial constraints on development, that intercore the values and development costs are going to be dramatically higher than they ordinarily would be. Okay, Robert, you had a...
Would they still allow you to buy land outside those areas?
You potentially could still buy the land, but you wouldn't be able to do anything with it. I mean, or they would restrict to the point of the density of the use and might say, you can, for every 10 acres, you can have a house. Well, that's going to put any sort of housing developer pretty much out of business of being able to do anything on any sort of scale. So it'd be, you know, more of the thing. Well, yeah, you can build a handful of custom homes, but outside of that, not a whole lot.
So you can have development. They kind of restrict.
Well, and in some cases, it may actually be to the point. This land is going to be reserved exclusively for timber production or exclusively, you know, for wildlife habitat or, you know, whatever it may be. And, you know, there's another reason as well, because by not allowing this to grow out here, the city doesn't provide infrastructure to it. You know, in terms of water service, sewer service, police service, fire service, schools, you know, all that sort of stuff, that once again, all of that stays relatively contained. And at some point, and this is kind of the interesting thing that tends to happen with these situations, is at some point prices get to an unsustainable level, and then the local government may step in and say, okay, we're going to release some of the land for development. And it may not be in any sort of predetermined, but someone ultimately that maybe owns the parcels right there, they say we're going to release that for development, all of a sudden, the person that did own that is now a multimillionaire.
So strategically, would it be profitable to buy these out parcels?
It could, if you honestly believe that, that it's going to, at some point, that's going to happen, but your holding period, you know, might be way outside of your lifetime.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the thing that, you know, there's no guarantee with that. It's just that, you know, once again, at some point they finally say, well, the bubble's about to burst here, we've got to do something to provide affordable housing for, you know, folks. Not everyone can afford a $500,000 home, so, you know, we've got to do something to, you know.
But if you're doing something long-term for your family, not necessarily just you, at some point they all got to pop, you know?
Potentially, but at the same time, you know, some communities, there may be other reasons or other constraints that may keep them from being able to pop. Like, for example, they have got a restricted amount of water.
Yep.
And so you really can't get any electric. I mean, that's one of the biggest struggles right now, like Las Vegas, is obviously they've built so much there and it was sort of unbridled growth, but their water issues are absolutely horrendous in terms of not having enough water to really, you know, satiate the demand. Okay, somebody else had a comment or question? Yep.
To prevent this type of sprawl out into the suburbs, do these municipalities, like you said, Seattle and places in Oregon, do they normally require like a mixed income development? Are there any incentives like that?
That's precisely, you know, part of the thing, that in order to get solutions to, you know, problems of overpriced housing, is they say, okay, we will allow you maybe to develop this area, but we're going to stipulate that you've got to set aside 25% as affordable housing. And if you do that, we'll let you develop.
You said Seattle was an example of this, and that was interesting because when we were doing our project, the average price per square foot was just, I thought it would be probably about the same as Miami hotspot. It was so much more.
Right.
And now this explains why you can't really build out there.
Yep. Nope, absolutely. I mean, and that's the part that, you know, it would be interesting if you were to take a map of the country and actually plot out like land cost per square foot and the huge variance that exists. I mean, you know, and it would blow your mind as to, you know, how varied it really can be and how we somehow still manage to survive doing whatever it is that we're doing, but it really, you know, is dramatic. You know, the whole thing that I can tell you, several cities in Texas, you can still go find a single family residential lot in a decent neighborhood in some cases for 10, 15 grand. You know, and then you're like, what? You know, I mean, how is that even possible? Whenever lots here, you know, maybe the cheapest you might be able to get might be more like 100 grand, you know, for a decent sort of lot. You know, so it's just, it's a fascinating thing that, but a lot of it, really honestly, it's driven by the growth controls. That's how important these growth controls are to the, because if Florida were to tomorrow just say, you can build anything, anywhere, all the barriers come down, it would have a massive, you know, impact on the current property values of the developed areas, but it would obviously, you know, cause a tremendous amount of growth to just automatically overnight occur, you know, in these, you know, the areas are immediately adjacent to these urbanized areas. Okay. All right. Other thoughts? Okay.
I had we went to Las Vegas and we got to go behind the scenes at the Venetian, and they spend $2 million a month on water.
Wow. Nice.
In Las Vegas.
I love
And they are LEED Platinum certified. So they have all the water saving cost initiatives.
So one of the things, as I said, that you can regulate as the developer, also as the local government, are design-related issues within a city. Architectural standards, details, appearance issues. So what do you think about a local government dictating something like that, or the developer for that matter, dictating what color your house can be, or what kind of roof you can have, or what sort of driveway you can have, or what kind of landscaping you can have, or that sort of thing. Tyler?
I think it's great, the developer, especially for the developer, because if you're going for a certain look within whatever development you're making, you need to make sure that your builders and your
yeah, because you believe that consistency and that
quality and
right, that hopefully it sets your development apart in some way, that people are going to seek you out because of those features. They don't have to live there. They don't have to buy a property there. But if that's what, something that they, deem that is important to them, now, one city that's probably at the city that's at the extreme of something like this, you probably already, what city you might think would be at the extreme of sort of design standards with regard to kind of everything almost looks the same? No, I'm talking about outside of Florida. One city. No. Santa Fe.
Sure, yeah.
Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe, New Mexico, what is everything built out of?
A hut.
It's basically adobe. Pretty much, and that's a requirement that virtually every single structure there has that look to it. And so as a result, you have this, huge consistency of what basically the city will allow as a design standard. I mean, do you agree or not? Yes, no?
I think that can get a little bit, there can be too much control in some of those cases, like in particular right here in Fort Lauderdale, the city has some restrictions where, say along, what's it called, 6th Avenue or 6th Street or whatever it is, Sistrunk, the old hood, so to speak, they require like the buildings to be pedestrian friendly, whereas there was a new retail complex built where the entrance had to be along 6th Street, whereas that area is not built for that.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it puts the developer in a situation where they have to have an entrance on the front and an entrance in the back where the parking lot is, because parking lot had to be on the middle.
Yep.
But now I come in as somebody who wants to come rent the space from you. I don't have a need for 2 entrances.
Right.
So it just puts, because now this particular center that I'm talking about has been pretty much empty for about 2-3 years since it's been built.
And see, that's another aspect to all of this, is just because the local government, has imposed whatever it is, they can effectively, many of their restrictions, like these design restrictions, aren't inherently market-based. Mm-hmm. They're, the thought is, the design sort of issues, they're trying to create some sort of, whether it's artificial or some sort of feeling or whatever it may be, by the design standards and the colors and the textures and all these sorts of things. But at the same time, if it's not maybe done in tandem with the whole community, that you may end up with these like pocket developments that are completely out of place. Yeah. Or until the whole thing is built out, that you can have all these standalone things that are kind of freaks because they don't really fit in with the context of how the neighborhood is otherwise.
In terms of Santa Fe, I mean, I think in general that that design restriction gives the whole thing like kind of a small, close community feel.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a thing.
Yeah.
And it is the sort of thing that you, as a developer or as a local government, to what extent do you want to be known for a certain thing? And some of it's out of necessity. Some of it's just simply we want to create some experience that maybe you can't get somewhere else, or we want to recreate it here, that you create maybe a European feel to a particular neighborhood because you have a bunch of people that may be relocated from a certain part of Europe here and they want that European feel. I mean, obviously Naples, I mean, to me, that's, has a very European feel to it. I mean, would you not disagree, or would you agree?
Yeah, our community is all based off like old world Tuscany, you know, and it's the same, and we have that feel everywhere you go in the community. The same with Naples is like they're
Yeah.
trying to resemble that high class, whatever it may be.
Yeah, but that in and of itself draws people to potentially want to live there. You know, that they say that's how I want to. That's what I want to wake up to in the morning. That's what I want to see whenever I drive down or walk down the street. And that's, you know, I want that maybe intimacy of maybe narrower streets and you know, the sidewalk cafes and whatever else makes, you know, so, you know, those things, you know, critically important. But yet they may cost more, you know, to actually get it to that point of where it actually looks and feels the way that it does. Okay. All right. So other things, I mean, like from a design perspective, obviously, and this is a good way to sort of think about this. Pretty much any local government, any developer can impose virtually any restriction they want to on how a property gets utilized. The caveat is, as I said earlier, and this is a key point, it can always be challenged in court. Okay? Now, here's the thing, though, to point out with that. Everything is deemed to be effectively legal and enforceable until it is found to not be legal or constitutional or whatever it may be. Now, you're saying, okay, so what? A lot of local governments, a lot of developers will put things purposely into whatever restrictions that they are creating and will go over the top with the things that they put into place, knowing pretty much full well if anyone really challenged them on those things, there's a very good chance that they would not win. But they also know that to mount a legal challenge is going to be an expensive thing. So a lot of people, you know, that would be joining that community or, you know, be a part of that community are just going to kind of like throw their hands up and say, not going to mess with it. We're just going to let, you know, they want to impose all these restrictions over everybody else. Fine, we'll move on.
And that probably happens in HOAs quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But it's an exceedingly important concept because you need to sort of be familiar with that just from the standpoint of as a developer, you know, you have a vision, you have a dream about what you're trying to create, you know, to what extent you really can go to the full extreme of putting these things out there and say, everyone in the community must wear a blue shirt on Monday. You know, you could pretty much almost get away with that, you know, to the point of, once again, somebody challenges it, you know, as to, you know, what it might actually, you know, and the relevancy of it and the, you know, all those sorts of things. You follow what I'm getting at?
Could someone even put a, like, racially motivated
No,
restriction?
okay, that one, obviously, you know, protected, you know, groups of any sort of racial issues or, you know, any, you know, sexual orientation or religious or, you know, any sort of protected, you know, automatic, you know, that gets whacked. But the things that are and have been, you know, getting a lot of attention are like age restricted communities. Okay? You know, once again, you as a developer are saying, I want to create this adult playground for 55 and older folks of being able to live here and not have any screaming kids running down the streets, you know, and everyone that lives here must be 55 and older, period, end of discussion. And, you know, those have gotten a lot of attention, you know, over the years, but it's a self-selection thing. But yet, what happens in the event that, you know, you and your spouse, you know, both of whom, you know, happen to be over 55, all of a sudden that maybe you gain custody of your grandchild or something like that, you know, to what extent you might actually be forced to move out of the community because you can't technically have a child in that community. You know, so there's some very interesting, you know, kinds of dynamics there of, you know, excluding people, you know, just simply based on their age. But yet, to a certain extent, you know, most of those have won in court. I mean, you know, I'm sure there are examples of ones that haven't, but, you know, to a certain extent, they can make that argument that, hey, you know, we're doing this because, you know, once again, it's a self-selection kind of thing. You agreed to the rules up front whenever you moved in and we sold you the property, and too bad, so sad that your circumstances somehow have changed. Any of you guys have any sort of...
No, I just, it's a stupid question. 55 and under. Have you ever heard of a community that would restrict that, or is that allowed? I mean, I can understand 55 and older.
I know, you know, for employment perspectives, it's a problem. You know, like employment in terms of the employment law prohibits you from age discrimination. You know, anyone that's over the age of whether it's either 40 or 45, that, you know, you can't be, but I don't know specifically if you could, you know, effectively say, I want a community that's, but you know, that's also kind of an interesting thing because I think I may have mentioned this, you know, that this group of developers, they were talking about a project that they had, and they were building this project for millennials, but yet the overwhelming majority of the people that end up occupying it were over 55s, you know, folks, because they like the whole free-spirited, you know, lifestyle of what they had created, you know, so
what was stopping him from saying, we don't, no.
Yeah, they didn't have anything in place.
But they could have.
Theoretically, I suppose they could, but I don't, you know, that's an excellent question. I mean, you know, whether or not, yeah, you could get away with something like that.
I thought it was a protected class.
What, sorry?
I thought they were a protected class under fair housing.
Well, but that's just it. You can, but yet, once again, you can have over 55 communities. So why not, you know, in one sense, yeah, it's a question of effectively, it's a one-sided kind of thing that once again, you can protect things to keep a bunch of old people together, but you can't effectively protect things to keep a bunch of younger people. So it's kind of an interesting...
It's like, I don't understand how the girls get free cover at clubs.
Okay, all right. We're not going down any of those roads, okay?
I completely agree with him.
We should actually bring discrimination on it.
Okay, before we deteriorate any further, let's take a 5-minute break.
5-minute break now.
5-minute break. Before you...
That's the way to start.
Thanks, Doug.
Good job, Dustin.
That's what comes out of the woodwork after, 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Just, you sure you don't need it for the remainder?
No, I was able to, I bought one.
Okay.
And then I was able to figure out how to get this one onto my...
Okay.
But I appreciate it.
Yep, absolutely.
Really just want it out of my hair because I'm like paranoid that I'm going to lose it again.
Finally, I got the document, so I can now read it. This is what we're doing.
I don't even know what he's saying.
It's in Spanish and they're translating it.
Well, you know, actually, have you tried that Google Translate?
It's
really good. I mean, it's a lot better than you think it would be. I was shocked. I mean, if you just capture the text in the Google Translate thing, and it will automatically translate, and actually does a really good job with it.
This is entirely.
Oh yeah.
Don't write a paper on it.
So we're gonna develop on this side and on this side.
Gotcha.
And this is where no hurricanes, but it's not impacted by hurricanes.
Interesting.
It's beautiful. It's Bali style.
Interesting.
But it's Caribbean, so it's zero impact from hurricanes. So 7 hotels, town, the largest, the airport, the marina.
I'm just saying.
Everybody has an opinion. So.
Absolutely. That's part of the process.
And how to start is
the land planning even.
Yeah, that was
the land planning and like.
I'm actually surprised.
We're gonna have Chinese, Spanish,
right,
and then the brands.
Right.
So the person in charge, like your friend was saying, needs to be able, at least with the principles, to communicate and understand culturally with the other.
Oh, yeah.
So enough of it.
Huge.
Then we were having some with the government, some misunderstandings on what they call tourism infrastructure versus what is necessary basic infrastructure that you need to protect. So that's what was part of what I wanted to talk to you. I made a list, I separated a list of things that.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Just let me know.
Okay. I've been working on this all this week because I have to prepare the initial.
Right.
Like the first 10 points.
Right.
And from there, chronogram.
Okay.
A timeline
Gotcha.
for the next 6 months. But like, what we should address, like,
Right.
main issues. Yes, higher
Right.
basically that, but
Right.
for me, something that it might be tourism infrastructure, is basic infrastructure, and it's another kind of development.
It sounds fascinating. I mean, I'd love to do it.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
I only read the two of them.
You're fine. Stop.
I said I'm not wearing it. Hey, listen.
No, seriously, you're fine right now.
Okay. No, I mean, it's just that, like, I had the same thing in undergrad. Every time I took a science class, it was like, I could study for 3 days straight. I could study for 2 weeks straight, no matter what, how much I studied. I got within 5% of the thing. I don't know. No, it's, I mean, that's really the truth. But whatever, I'll wait 10 minutes.
Go for the hours.
You know, I forgot that Monday was a holiday.
You know,
So, talking about the,
you're on the lines in perfect order.
doing it.
Tomorrow night I'll
I'll be back. Yep.
She work or something today?
She work?
Today? She doing something today?
No, but I'm not gonna have, I got church tomorrow, so I'm not gonna really have time. Then I gotta arrange somebody to watch my kids, so.
But the newbie coming too, right? My girl is pregnant. My girl is pregnant too.
Oh, yeah? Great.
We just, not just found out, but she's about, I think, 5 months.
Just so that you know, the test,
You better get married.
there were 6 A's, 2 perfect scores of 100. That was with the 4-point curve. And then 1 B and then 6 C's. So basically that's how it broke out.
Whoop, whoop.
And it's interesting that even the top 2 people that got the 96s that ultimately became hundreds, they didn't miss the same thing. They missed 2 different questions in both instances. It was a stupid
I
mistake.
think they were collaborating.
They missed the code. That code signal. Got it messed up.
You all right, Mark? You okay?
Yeah, I mean, it was good.
Did you get Red Bull?
I've been drinking a lot of Coke. I was gonna go to Starbucks, but.
You should have told them that.
You know, I tried drinking that stuff like a few years ago. It makes me feel like I'm gonna pass out.
I took one on a 10-hour trip to Atlanta. It didn't do anything. And I went and got my typical the iced latte that I get sometimes, and that was perfect. But that thing did nothing for me. Or the 5-hour energy drink, it doesn't do anything.
The Red Bull did nothing for you?
Because I'm naturally high.
All the time. I already got wings, bro.
All things considered.
No. I'm sure one day it's just going to be for me. I'm just going to be like, it's just like,
I do not know how you drink so much Red Bull.
Does it have like a pineapple swing to it?
Back in the old days, I used
I know they're
to
yellow.
you'd go to the bar and get like a Red Bull and vodka.
Absolutely.
I'd always wake up at 3 in the morning. What is wrong with my heart? I don't get it.
what have I done to myself? Yeah. Oh. Yeah, back in my heyday, whenever I was probably your age, I mean, I honestly, and I'm not exaggerating, there were times where I probably had a half dozen or more in one day. And, you know, it was just.
I touch one of those, my stomach just goes to crap.
That's what.
Not like. It's bad. Let's just say it doesn't feel good.
I have no tolerance for caffeine. I had an espresso lunch at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Totally forgot about it. At 3 a.m. I was wondering why I was still awake.
Okay, a couple of other little things that I want to talk about from this that are of extreme importance. One is what is referred to as the vesting of development rights. Anybody have any idea what is meant by that statement? Vesting of development rights. Now, you've probably heard the word vesting in the context of like retirement plans and things like that, that you know, you become vested in the retirement plan after X number of years and that sort of thing. Well, to a certain extent, it's kind of the same sort of thing, but with development, usually what it revolves around is what level of approvals do you have to achieve in order to be effectively locked in and able to do whatever it is that you want to do and have the right to do that, even though there may be changes forthcoming by the local government, but they can't take away what rights that you have already been vested in.
Right.
Does that make sense? Now, under normal situations, usually your development rights get vested the moment you pull a building permit. Normally. Normally. A building permit. Not whenever you purchase the property, but usually whenever you pull the building permit, because the whole thing of you purchase the property, all right, you still have, you know, investment-backed expectations, and the local government has effectively said you can build X, Y, Z supposedly on this property, but while you own that property, before you actually pull a building permit, the local government could come in and say, we're changing the zoning on this property due to, you know, like a perfect case in point that I have seen over and over again is that you have land that was maybe designated to be built multifamily residential. And the local government says, we have way too much multifamily residential, it's a huge burden on our infrastructure in terms of water and sewer and you know, too many school kids, you know, that we're having to potentially, you know, take care of and deal with. So what we're going to do is we're effectively going to rezone all the land that has not yet been developed, but yet is currently zoned for multifamily residential, and we're going to convert all that land to single-family residential large lot. Okay, and because you know what, you know, once again, it was one of those sorts of things that you're saying, well, why would they all this, you know, or why didn't they think about that way back when, and that sort of thing? Because over time, you know, they may have set aside all this land for multifamily residential, but no one really honestly thought about the long-term implications of having so much multifamily residential concentrated, you know, within the city. I mean, and once again, you know, my experience coming from Texas, you know, where we would have complex after complex after complex, you know, built in close proximity to each other of all these multifamily product, you know, and then like I said, the local government steps in and says, no more. We're going to convert all to single family residential, large lot sizes, and that sort of thing. So my point is, as the developer, if you had just bought that land, you would have not vested in your development rights upon the purchase of that multifamily residential land until you had pulled your building permit and effectively said, my intention is to now build 100 units of multifamily residential on this property. Now you're locked and loaded in the sense of being able to move forward with what you're proposing, and so that if the local government decides to make all those changes, it's not going to affect you. And there's a whole other issue that once something is built, the whole grandfathering and the pre-existing non-conforming use, that's a separate issue. Yep.
All right, so a very specific example. We are looking to build a wind energy project in Michigan. This other company, a competitor of ours, it's zoned agricultural. They got their permit to zone it as agricultural slash, wind energy. They got their site plan approved, but they haven't pulled building permits yet. The county doesn't like these guys because they're a bunch of assholes. So the county wants to institute a moratorium.
And so they never issue the building permit?
Yeah, never issued the building permit.
No, but I'm saying that they would delay the issuance of the building permit. Because I've seen this enough times that it's like you've gone through everything, and then you're down there, and then the last thing to get those development rights vested is that building permit to be issued. But then they say we have something in process, and so they delay the issuance of the building permit until after they've created the regulation that now forbids it.
But don't they have a legal recourse to say, hey, listen, all of our approvals are tied up. The building permit itself was a matter of a rubber stamp process to see.
That is all. That's why I'm saying that in the majority of instances, the state law usually states vesting of the development rights does not occur until the building permit has been issued.
So
that's the trigger, if you will.
What if you got a structural permit, but you didn't have your building permit yet?
Once again, maybe getting too fine of a point, but I would argue that it's still going to be triggered by the building permit. Because it's possible.
What do you mean structural?
Well, structural, doesn't necessarily.
It's not fit.
It's
the building off and piles and all that.
Yeah, it's more of what you're doing with the actual site itself, as opposed to what's ultimately going to be built on
But
it.
usually when you're doing that, you still need to have some sort of site plan approval, so they'll see what you're doing.
Yeah, but I guess my point is, and this is what I guess I'm trying to convey, and sort of backing up what Ryan is saying, is that you can go through all of this pre-planning, all of this regulatory stuff, ultimately to get down to the point of where you're ready to go, you're ready to start construction, and all of a sudden the local government or county, whoever is potentially issuing the building permit, says, nope, not going to do it. We're going to delay this, for a little while, and they don't really give you a good reason for the delay, but part of the reason is they're potentially going in and actually changing what can happen on that property because they didn't anticipate, in some cases. Now, in that particular case, they've gone through this whole other set of approval processes, but in some instances, it may just be that they did not think what was going to happen would happen.
Right.
A perfect example of a simple one that I saw that, I don't know, that blew me out of the water. It was just kind of like, really, was back in Texas, there was a place they wanted to open up a bingo hall, okay? And so the owner of the property, went through all the legitimate processes of getting the property effectively ready, had talked to the city officials about it. It was a legitimate use within the use classifications for this particular property. But you had someone within the city that made the determination they didn't want to have a bingo hall in this particular area of town. So they kind of put up a fuss, and literally 2 days before the building permit was supposed to be issued, the city council had a meeting, changed the zoning, ultimately precluding these folks from actually opening up or actually getting the permit to start construction to turn it into a bingo hall.
How do you deal with something like that when, okay, you're going into a purchase and you have a certain amount of a time period of your due diligence, and you did the groundwork, and you figure, listen, I'm going to get my site plan approval, I'll probably get this permit, and then you got to deal with something like that, because I'm guessing sellers are not going to give you that much leeway.
No, not normally, no. I mean, sometimes, what a lot of sellers will do is they will say, we will sell this to you on the contingency that you can maybe get the zoning changed, but most of them aren't going to hang with you all the way through the permitting process.
Right.
And the only reason to bring this up, guys, is simply from the standpoint of be aware that it's not automatic. Just because you purchase a piece of land and it effectively is zoned for whatever use that you're intending to do does not mean that you can hold that land for any length of time and have the expectation that you're going to be able to build on. Another perfect example of this are like shoreline developments. This is actually where a lot of the court cases were born out, that you had folks that bought land in California that was like on the coastline, and they wanted to build homes there that, you know, overlooked the ocean and ultimately restricted beach access and that sort of thing. And the local government, basically California Coastal Commission or whatever, came in and says, we're not gonna, you know, allow you to do that. And so you had these sort of things that, once again, I, as the property purchaser, developer, bought this property with certain investment-backed expectations to build whatever it was I was going to build there, and now I'm being told, no, can't do it, you know, because we're not going to issue a building permit because we are effectively rewriting the law to effectively say no more beachfront development kind of thing. But here's the interesting thing. Then the courts begin to take up this, and then it's a question of whether that is a taking. Okay, have you ever heard that term before?
Yeah.
Okay, and there's a difference between like a physical taking and an economic taking. A physical taking is you have a piece of land that you've bought, and I as the government step in and say, I am taking possession and ownership of your land, and I'm not going to give you a penny for it. They can't do that. They have got to give you just compensation if they take your land, you know, in the sense of we're taking it for a highway or whatever, some sort of right-of-way or whatever it might be, or economic development purposes in some instances. But the point being is they've got to give you some sort of a compensation for that. But yet an economic taking is an interesting one, because you bought this property for, let's say, $1 million to build this home on, this beachfront property, and now all of a sudden the government is saying, we're not going to take your land physically, but what we are going to do is we're going to limit what you can actually build on it to be virtually nothing. And so therefore, is that really a taking? Yeah. You follow what I'm saying? They haven't physically taken your land. They have diminished the value of your land to virtually nothing, or to a very minimal amount compared to what you originally bought it for. And what effectively the courts, for the most part, kind of came back and said is, yeah, they can do that up to, you know, a certain point. They can't maybe take all of the economic value, but it's certainly within their rights, the government this is, to come in and effectively rezone the land, reclassify the land. And so those investment-backed expectations of you paying $1 million for this land, and now it's worth maybe $100,000. Too bad, so sad.
Right.
Any thoughts on that?
So one is physical and the other one's what?
Economic. Okay, because the physical taking, you know, as I said, you know, that's really simple. You know, they've taken possession of your land, taken it away from you.
Eminent domain.
Yeah, through eminent domain. But an economic taking is, well, we've effectively rezoned your land to where it's now worthless.
Wow.
This is a primary argument that I ran into in a project in New York, where you can put a wind turbine so close to a house before it gets too loud and too noisy. So, but the problem is that distance is further away than just the safety fall down distance of the turbine. So the municipality was arguing that by putting a turbine, let's say 500 feet from a property line, it's safe enough where it's not going to fall on the other property, but it still has effects on the other property.
Yes.
So legally, I mean, where might a court draw the line there? Because I mean, you could put a pig farm right on your property line, and it's not necessarily preventing you from building a house right next to it. It just wouldn't be prudent at that point.
Right. No, I mean, it's easily an argument that can be made in court that, you know, until the precedents have been set, you know, that ultimately apply to across the country, that, you know, it begins to be kind of a region by region sort of thing. And that's, you know, with land use law, that's how it works. It starts with, you know, one case in, you know, an area that ultimately kind of rises up within that area with regard to where the legal coverage effectively, you know, would be applied. And so, you know, the first thing you have to do is to take a look at, you know, what are the other sort of precedents for that within that area to kind of, you know, begin to see what may apply. But most of the time, they are within their rights, you know, if they can say, because pretty much all government powers with regard to land use controls devolve into health, safety, general welfare, and morals. The last one's kind of an interesting one, but
That's why they have police.
for the most part, local governments, state government, federal government, when it comes to land use restrictions, their power, for the most part, has to somehow fall within kind of one of those four broad categories. Now, the last one has kind of, for the most part, been kind of whacked out, over the years of how do you effectively legislate morality? And a lot of that was court cases that dealt with like sexually oriented businesses and things like that, of how do you go about regulating where those can locate, how far away from schools and churches and things like that those kind of businesses would need to be. And a lot of court battles were fought with those particular. One of my absolute, actually, a sort of a simple sidebar. It was kind of this, to me, it's one of the most entertaining one of all. You had a municipality that you had these two sexually oriented businesses that were side by side, but the local restriction was that effectively they must be more than 1,000 feet effectively away from each other to be allowed to operate. In other words, they did not want to have a congregating of a kind of a red light district, and so they mandated they must be so many feet away from schools, churches, all that other sort of stuff, but also had to be like 1,000 feet away from each other, okay? And so what was fascinating about this was that the owners, the two different owners of these properties were like, well, A was here first, B came along, B is not in compliance, all right? And so what does B do? This is the beauty of this kind of land use sort of control thing. The owner of B hires the guy who wrote the ordinance for the city as a consultant to figure out a loophole in the ordinance. The way in which the ordinance was written, this is how weird and funky this stuff gets. The way the ordinance was written was the distance was measured in walking distance from front door to front door of the establishments. So here's the front door, and originally the distance was, however many feet it was, but it didn't meet the threshold of 1,000 feet. So basically what they did was they built a fence. So now you had to walk around the fence in order to get from one to the other. Brilliant. Yeah, but I mean, this is the sort of stuff, to me it's fascinating stuff. Regardless of what you think about the business, that's not the point. It's fascinating sort of gimmickry and kind of, nonsense that, will take place and these sort of environments of people doing their best to comply with whatever, the rules are, or eventually try to beat the system in some way. But anyway, without going too far down that road, getting back to specifically the government powers that they have with regards to sort of land use constraints, most of them need to fall within this health, safety, and general welfare. Now, the health and safety ones are super simple. That's the whole thing of, you want to, as you were saying about the pig farms, part of that is not just the smell and whatever, but, also could be a disease-related, concern. And so, regulate the use based upon that. Or it could, very well be, the health of people, like, the whole thing of having flight patterns, going over your head, to what extent that keeps you awake at night, and so they would regulate and say, well, you can only fly from 8 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. Thus the reason why you have so many airports that have those kind of restrictions in place. And so they can regulate those things fairly simple. The general welfare thing is a fascinating category because it kind of begins to be this, sort of all-inclusive. If it doesn't fit within health and safety, we try to kind of classify it as general welfare. Well, general welfare, for the most part, is the idea of what is best for the community as a whole.
Common good.
Yeah, the common good. And so, you know, allowing this kind of use or precluding this kind of use, is this the best thing for the community, which is debatable. You know, of how do you really determine that? And usually the way it gets determined is, this is what we were sort of talking about earlier, is if you have a massive turnout of your citizenry opposing something, then the general assumption is that's bad for general welfare. Do you follow the logic? And so that's where the local governments, in many cases, that's where they fold, you know, really easily, is whenever you have massive turnouts, because instantly they say, well, the court challenge is going to come in and say, well, you know, the community has shown up and shown their support or lack of support for whatever it may be, and so therefore, because of that, we're going to effectively deny it or approve it. Make sense? Okay. Questions? Okay. All right. Next one, release provisions. Totally separate topic, or totally unrelated topic. Release provisions are as a subdivider of land, if you have effectively a loan on that land, on those subdivided parcels, you may have a situation, once again, okay, you've created this little cul-de-sac with all these lots. And this could be on commercial as well in terms of out parcels and that sort of thing. But you want to be able to sell off those individual lots or individual out parcels. If you were talking about, once again, on the commercial side, you know, you've got a shopping center and, you know, you've got a, just a sort of by comparison, on the commercial side, you've got like maybe an L-shaped shopping center with individual stores, but you have this out parcel out here that may be able to be sold off for a restaurant or, you know, some other freestanding, you know, sort of store, but the loan may preclude you from actually being able to do that unless you have release provisions that allow you to do that. In other words, because normally what happens is you will get a loan covering the entire parcel, and your lender will say, you can't go selling off bits and pieces of this without our approval. Because what they don't want to have happen is you sell off all the best bits and pieces, and then then they get stuck with potentially the unsaleable junk, even though that it may actually be, like for example, you know, on this cul-de-sac, I'm just going to just say this at random, that maybe it's super easy maybe for you to sell D, E, and F. Maybe those are considered to be the prime spots on the cul-de-sac, but yet all these others would command a much lower price point, and therefore the bank, you know, is going to basically set up standards that sort of say, we're going to actually pre-establish the dollar values of maybe each of these parcels, and then as you sell them, then we will allow you to release a certain percentage of the loan or pay down a certain percentage of the loan as you sell them off. Yep.
With all like loans, isn't the entire loan due upon sale?
Not in the situation of this kind of development activity. They're purposely set up as land development loans to allow for these sort of release provisions that once you, and this is the beauty of the subdivision process, that you have effectively taken, you know, you've bought the entire parcel with the intent of breaking it into these multiple individual parcels, but in order to dispose of them, you know, each one is going to have a new owner, and it may be initially the home builder that takes it off of your hands. The home builder buys the lot from you, potentially, you know, depending on how it's sort of set up. In a lot of cases, it may actually just be the home owner, and they end up hiring the builder to ultimately come in and build. But in some cases, it'll actually be a builder will come in and buy multiple lots at a time and then build either spec houses or homes that ultimately they have contracts for to build. But like over here on the commercial side, it's like the bank doesn't inherently maybe want you selling off this out parcel before you maybe developed the other part or fill up the other individual units. Does that make sense? Any questions on the kind of the, yeah?
So why do you call it provisions then? It's like the language on the contract with the bank?
Yeah, it's called a release provision within effectively your loan documentation. It's effectively a clause within effectively your loan documentation that would allow you, provide for you to be able to have those individual subparcels released from. In other words, what you're effectively doing with that release provision is allowing you as the developer to say, I'm going to sell off this parcel I to whoever for this dollar amount, and as a result of having done so, that is going to reduce my loan balance by X number of dollars.